Chapter 7. Visiting. One morning, as Miss Matty and I sat at our work, it was before 12 o'clock, and Miss Matty had not changed the cap with yellow ribbons that had been Miss Jenkins's best, and which Miss Matty was now wearing out in private, putting on the one made in imitation of Mrs. Jameson's at all times when she expected to be seen. Martha came up and asked if Miss Betty Barker might speak to her mistress. Miss Matty assented and quickly disappeared to change the yellow ribbons, while Miss Barker came upstairs. But as she had forgotten her spectacles and was rather flurried by the unusual time of the visit, I was not surprised to see her return with one cap on the top of the other. She was quite unconscious of it herself and looked at us with bland satisfaction. Nor do I think Miss Barker perceived it, for, putting aside the little circumstance that she was not so young as she had been, she was very much absorbed in her errand, which she delivered herself of with an oppressive modesty that found vent in endless apologies. Miss Betty Barker was the daughter of the old clerk at Cranford who had officiated in Mr. Jenkins's time. She and her sister had had pretty good situations as ladies' maids, and had saved money enough to set up a milliner shop, which had been patronized by the ladies in the neighborhood. Lady Arley, for instance, would occasionally give Miss Barker's the pattern of an old cap of hers, which they immediately copied and circulated among the elite of Cranford. I say the elite, for Miss Barker's had caught the trick of the place, and piqued themselves upon their aristocratic connection. They would not sell their caps and ribbons to anyone without a pedigree. Many a farmer's wife or daughter turned away huffed from Miss Barker's select millinery, and went rather to the universal shop, where the profits of brown soap and moist sugar enabled the proprietor to go straight to Paris, he said, until he found his customers too patriotic and John Bullish to wear what the Mounseers wore, London, where, as he often told his customers, Queen Adelaide had appeared only the very week before in a cap exactly like the one he showed them, trimmed with yellow and blue ribbons, and had been complimented by King William on the becoming nature of her headdress. Miss Barkers, who confined themselves to truth and did not approve of miscellaneous customers, throve notwithstanding. They were self-denying, good people. Many a time have I seen the eldest of them, she that had been maid to Mrs. Jameson, carrying out some delicate mess to a poor person. They only aped their betters in having nothing to do with the class immediately below theirs. And when Miss Barker died, their profits and income were found to be such that Miss Betty was justified in shutting up shop and retiring from business. She also, as I think I have before said, set up her cow, a mark of respectability in Cranford almost as decided as setting up a gig is among some people. She dressed finer than any lady in Cranford, and we did not want her at it, for it was understood that she was wearing out all the bonnets and caps and outrageous ribbons which had once formed her stock in trade. It was 5 or 6 years since she had given up shop, so in any other place than Cranford her dress might have been considered passé. And now Miss Betty Barker had called to invite Miss Matty to tea at her house on the following Tuesday. She gave me also an impromptu invitation, as I happened to be a visitor, though I could see she had a little fear lest since my father had gone to live in Drumble, he might have engaged in that horrid cotton trade, and so dragged his family down out of aristocratic society. She prefaced this invitation with so many apologies that she quite excited my curiosity. Her presumption was to be excused. What had she been doing? She seemed so overpowered by it, I could only think that she had been writing to Queen Adelaide to ask for a receipt for washing lace. But the act which she so characterized was only an invitation she had carried to her sister's former mistress, Mrs. Jameson. Her former occupation considered, could Miss Matty excuse the liberty? Ah, thought I, she has found out that double cap and is going to rectify Miss Matty's headdress. No, it was simply to extend her invitation to Miss Matty and to me. Miss Matty bowed acceptance, and I wondered that, in the graceful action, she did not feel the unusual weight and extraordinary height of her headdress. But I do not think she did, for she recovered her balance and went on talking to Miss Betty in a kind, condescending manner, very different from the fidgety way she would have had if she had suspected how singular her appearance was. "Mrs. Jameson is coming, I think," you said. "Yes, Mrs. Jameson most kindly and condescendingly said she would be happy to come. One little stipulation she made, that she should bring Carlo. I told her that if I had a weakness, it was for dogs." "And Miss Pole?" questioned Miss Matty, who was thinking of her pool at preference, in which Carlo would not be available as a partner. "I am going to ask Miss Pole. Of course, I could not think of asking you, madam, the rector's daughter, madam. Believe me, I do not forget the situation my father held under yours." "And Miss Forrester, of course?" "And Miss Forrester. I thought, in fact, of going to her before I went to Miss Pole. Although her circumstances are changed, madam, she was born at Tyrell, and we can never forget her alliance to the Bigges of Bigelow Hall." Miss Matty cared much more for the little circumstance of her being a very good card player. "Mrs. Fitzadam, I suppose?" "No, madam. I must draw a line somewhere. Mrs. Jameson would not, I think, like to meet Mrs. Fitzadam. I have the greatest respect for Mrs. Fitzadam, but I cannot think her fit society for such ladies as Mrs. Jameson and Miss Matilda Jenkins." Miss Betty Barker bowed low to Miss Matty and pursed up her mouth. She looked at me with sidelong dignity, as much as to say, although a retired milliner, she was no democrat and understood the difference of ranks. "May I beg you to come as near 6:30 to my little dwelling as possible, Miss Matilda? Mrs. Jameson dines at 5, but has kindly promised not to delay her visit beyond that time, 6:30. And with a swimming curtsy, Miss Betty Barker took her leave. My prophetic soul foretold a visit that afternoon from Miss Pole, who usually came to call on Miss Matilda after any event, or in sight of any event, to talk it over with her. "Miss Betty told me it was to be a choice and select few," said Miss Pole, as she and Miss Matty compared notes. "Yes, so she said. Not even Mrs. Fitzadam." Now, Mrs. Fitzadam was the widowed sister of the Cranford surgeon, whom I have named before. Their parents were respectable farmers, content with their station. The name of these good people was Hoggins. Mr. Hoggins was the Cranford doctor now. We disliked the name and considered it coarse. But, as Miss Jenkins said, if he changed it to Piggins, it would not be much better. We had hoped to discover a relationship between him and that Marchioness of Exeter whose name was Molly Hoggins. Of the man, careless of his own interests, utterly ignored and denied any such relationship, although, as dear Miss Jenkins had said, he had a sister called Mary, and the same Christian names were very apt to run in families. Soon after Miss Mary Hoggins married Mr. Fitzadam, she disappeared from the neighborhood for many years. She did not move in a sphere in Cranford sufficiently high to make any of us care to know what Mr. Fitzadam was. He died and was gathered to his fathers without us ever having thought about him at all. And then Mrs. Fitzadam reappeared in Cranford, as bold as a lion, Miss Pole said, a well-to-do widow, dressed in rustling black silk, so soon after her husband's death that poor Miss Jenkins was justified in the remark she made that Bombazine would have shown a deeper sense of her loss. I remember the convocation of ladies who assembled to decide whether or not Mrs. Fitzadam should be called upon by the old blue-blooded inhabitants of Cranford. She had taken a large rambling house which had been usually considered to confer a patent of gentility upon its tenant because once upon a time, 70 or 80 years before, the spinster daughter of an earl had resided in it. I am not sure if the inhabiting this house was not also believed to convey some unusual power of intellect, for the earl's daughter, Lady Jane, had a sister, Lady Anne, who had married a general officer in the time of the American War, and this general officer had written 1 or 2 comedies, which were still acted on the London boards, and which, when we saw them advertised, made us all draw up and feel that Drury Lane was paying a very pretty compliment to Cranford. Still, it was not at all a settled thing that Mrs. Fitzadam was to be visited when dear Miss Jenkins died, and with her something of the clear knowledge of the strict code of gentility went out too. As Miss Pole observed, as most of the ladies of good family in Cranford were elderly spinsters or widows without children, if we did not relax a little and become less exclusive, by and by we shall have no society at all. Mrs. Forrester continued on the same side. She had always understood that Fitz meant something aristocratic. There was Fitzroy. She thought that some of the king's children had been called Fitzroy. And there was Fitzclarence now. They were the children of dear good King William IV. Fitzadam. It was a pretty name, and she thought it very probably meant child of Adam. No one who had not some good blood in their veins would dare to be called Fitz. There was a deal in a name. She had had a cousin who spelled his name with 2 little f's, Fawkes, and he always looked down upon capital letters and said they belonged to lately invented families. She had been afraid he would die a bachelor, he was so very choice. When he met with a Mrs. Farringdon at a watering place, he took to her immediately, and a very pretty genteel woman she was, a widow with a very good fortune. And my cousin, Miss Fawkes, married her, and it was all owing to her 2 little f's. Mrs. Fitzadam did not stand a chance of meeting with a Mr. Fitz anything in Cranford, so that could not have been her motive for settling there. Miss Matty thought